Hi boys and girls, I'm back with another book. I found this one at Central when I was cleaning up, and I was cleaning up Ritter this week too, putting all the books back that you guys left in your desk. So here we go. This is Nubs, the true story of a mutt, a marine, and a miracle. Sounds good to me. I've never read this story, so we'll be reading it together. It's written by Major Brian Dennis, Kirby Larson, and Mary Netherly. I guess they consulted and read it or wrote it together. Looks good. All right, there's the intro page. Here he is. Outside a border fort in the desert of western Iraq, a small, thin dog watched and waited. His ears had been cut off to make him a dog of war. Ooh. He had no name and no person to call his own. Despite his size, he was the leader of his pack, a group of wild dogs that survived by eating desert mice and rats and scraps from the Iraqi soldiers stationed at the fort. There he is. As the dog scanned the desert for possible meal, the stillness of the fall morning was broken by the roar of the engines rumbling closer and closer. He hunkered down in the sand. 3 military Humvees carrying the Major Brian Dennis and his 10 Marines lumbered to a stop. They were part of the Border Transition Team 352, there to help train the Iraqi soldiers. The other pack dogs raced to greet the men, probably hoping for some food. But the dog without ears cautiously approached Brian, who knelt down on one knee to meet him. I'll call him Nubs because his ears look like little nubs. Aw. That night, Nubs and Brian ate dinner together. They shared Brian's MREs, meals ready to eat, of spaghetti and Cajun beans and rice. For dessert, Nubs sampled a strawberry Pop-Tart, wagging his tail. Later that evening, Nubs stayed with Brian when it was his turn at guard duty. Together, they kept everyone safe. He's making a friend. The next day, Brian gave Nubs an extra long belly rub, and then he stepped into his Humvee and drove away. Aw. The whole pack chased after the vehicles, but quickly lost interest and turned back. Not Nubs. Running faster and faster, he tried to catch up with Brian. He ran for more than a mile. I lost my place. He had no way of knowing that it was against the rules for Marines to have pets. Left behind, Nubs started after the Humvees as they disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert. Oh, so Nubs kept following him. Long, lonely weeks passed without any sight of that trio of Humvees the Marines called Scout, Boss, and Chuck. At the fort, without Brian there, were no belly rubs. Winter's cold winds began to scour the desert, leaving Nubs scrambling for some place warm to sleep. As the pack leader, he faced constant challenges from younger dogs wanting his job, and sometimes groups of dogs from other forts fought Nubs for his pack over the little food they had. Nubs lived his rough, harsh life, waiting for each time Boss carried Brian back to him. So he's waiting for the Marines to come back. Oh, and here he's sending messages. On our last trip north, I was expecting to see Nubs again. I didn't. We didn't make it as far north as we had last trip, but I still thought I'd see him. I hope that crazy little dog is okay, he says. Oh, here's winter time. Near the end of December, when the temperatures dipped to bone-chilling 30 degrees, the Humvees again rumbled up to the border fort. The pack of dogs ran to greet Brian, but not Nubs. He hung back, gaunt and weak from a deep wound in his side. Oh, poor Nubs. Shivering from pain, Nubs allowed Brian and the team medic to clean the wound and apply antiseptic ointment from the men's first aid kit. He even swallowed the child-sized dose of antibiotics Brian gave him, but Nub refused to eat or drink. It hurt so much he tried to sleep standing up. Poor Nubs, he's injured. And here's a note from Brian. We tried to put a blanket on Nubs when we bedded down for the night in the desert, but he wouldn't let us. I said a prayer for him. He slept near me, and it got down to 18 degrees that night, and I kept waking up to check on him. Every time I woke up, I wondered if he'd be alive. Aw. When Brian got up at 4 a.m. for his turn to watch Nubs, Nubs stiffly padded into place beside him, head and tail drooping. He faithfully made the rounds with Brian. The next day, Nubs watched as Brian and his team prepared to leave. He touched his nose to Brian's face as Brian bent down to pet him goodbye, and he felt Brian's head on his head and whisper, "Hey, buddy, you need to eat. You need to get better." Aww. Then Brian climbed into Boss, and the three Humvees pulled away, determined not to be left behind again. Nubs chased after Brian. He couldn't keep up. Alone, he returned to the fort. 2 long weeks later, Scout, Boss, and Chuck thundered up to Nubs' fort again, and this time Nubs was there to greet them, tail wagging, but still moving slowly. For a few peaceful days, Nubs stuck close to his human pack. Brian took special care of him, doctoring his wound every morning. Nubs gobbled up his share of Brian's MREs, especially the beef patties. They wrestled and played. "Give me 5, Brian rubbed Nubs' belly. Every time he asked. If Brian stopped too soon, Nubs pawed him and made him rub some more. He really likes Brian, doesn't he? Each night after the sun set over the desert, Nub and Brian did their job together under an ice-packed black sky. Thousands of stars. They kept watch over everyone. All too soon it was time for Brian to leave again, and Nubs followed close on his heels. Brian tightened his winter scarf of keffiyeh around his neck and then climbed inside the Humvee. He leaned out and said to Nubs, "You take care of yourself, buddy." The vehicle rolled across the desert, slowly at first and then picking up speed, heading for the command outpost far away on the Jordanian border. Nubs cried as he chased them across the cold, coarse sand. Because of his wound, he could not keep up. He dropped to the ground exhausted and completely alone. Oh, how sad. When Nubs sat up, Scout, Boss, and Chuck were out of sight. He struggled to his feet and began walking. Aw. Here's where he was, and here's where they were going. Nubs trekked mile after treacherous mile across the desert, shivering through frozen days and nights. There was little to eat and even less to drink. With barely a moment's rest, Nubs pushed on, fighting his way through the territories fiercely protected by wolves and wild dogs. He's going after Brian. 2 snowy days and 70 miles later, Nubs limped into the Iraqi battalion headquarters where Brian was working. Oh my goodness. A team member ran inside shouting to Brian, "You're not going to believe this." Nubs went after him and found him. How special is that? Oh my goodness. Oh my. Look at the picture of Brian and Nubs. When Nubs saw Brian, he ran with his tongue out and tail wagging right into his arms. "What are you doing here?" Brian said as he held Nubs close and rubbed him all over. Nubs finally felt warm again. He pressed his wet nose against Brian's cheek. Nubs watched Brian climb into Boss, ordering his team back to the command outpost just half a mile away. I know we're not supposed to have dogs at the outpost, Brian said to his men, but if he followed us, what can we do? He followed them 70 miles to be with Brian. Oh my goodness, he was that attached. How special. Aw, look at him there. He's eating pancakes, and he's got his own little dog house now. When the Humvees began to roll, Nubs trotted right behind them until they reached the command outpost. Starving and exhausted from his ordeal, Nubs wolfed down pancakes, eggs, and sausages the Marines brought him, and he made dog angels rolling over and over in the freshly fallen snow. A few days later, he found a brand new doghouse built just for him. Nubs liked living at the command outpost with Brian's men and all the other soldiers. He proudly wore a collar the Marines had fashioned from woven bracelets sent to them from school children back home. He cheered up his new friends, collecting belly rubs and making them laugh, and even though he had his own doghouse, most nights Nubs curled up in the barracks with Brian and his team. Aw. Let's see. Here's a note from Brian. Then all came crashing to a halt when two soldiers who were not part of our team reported us, and we were given 4 days to get rid of the dog or else. That night I sat down and talked to my Marines. We knew that if we took Nubs back to the fort, he would come back to us. That made the decision easy for me. Nubs was going to America. This dog had been through a lifetime of fighting, war, and abuse, and was going to have a nice, sunny life that he could begin again. Nubs sat close by Brian as he emailed his family and friends back home, and he supervised the men as they put up flyers to raise money needed for his journey. Nubs was the first to hear the good news. Family and friends wanted to help, and Nub posed for his passport photo. He took 3 baths in 3 days to get ready for his trip. Aw. So he was going to go to America because the soldiers weren't allowed to keep him on the base. Aw. On the last day, Brian packed Nub's brown blanket and his favorite superhero toy. Brian made a leash for him out of rope. Nubs didn't play with anyone as he usually did. Instead, he sat quietly in a corner. When it was time to go, Brian scooped him up, put him in Boss. Together they drove to no man's land, the zone between Iraq and Jordan, and there they met the brother of Brian's interpreter, who had agreed to help get Nubs from Jordan to the States. He was escorted by a Jordanian official. Nubs rested in Brian's arms as he was carried to the Land Rover. He felt Brian's breath tickle his ear. "Be good, buddy. Don't cause any trouble. These guys will take good care of you, and I'll see you in a couple of months, I promise." So there he is. There he's getting ready to go to America. Wow. Nubs sat at the border checkpoint for hours as officials pored over his paperwork, making sure everything was in order, and finally Nubs arrived in Amman, Jordan. The king of Jordan's veterinarian gave him his first checkup and shots, and he stayed at the vet's kennels while his travel was being arranged. There he is. And there's going to be his trip. 2 weeks later, Nubs flew the 10-hour flight from Amman to Chicago. Friends of Brian's picked him up at the airport, and Nubs ate steak and strawberry Pop-Tarts for dinner. A few days later, Nubs flew out of Chicago on the last leg of his long journey. When Nubs stepped off the plane in San Diego, he was greeted with banners and cameras. He patiently posed for the paparazzi, but was glad to leave the airport crowd with Brian's friends Eric and Chrissy. Nubs slept in a comfy new bed, tried all kinds of tasty food, and went on walks in the dog park. But someone was missing. Who was missing? Brian, of course. Oh, here he is. On March 23rd, 2008, Eric and Chrissy drove Nubs to Camp Pendleton. The paparazzi were there. Again, Nubs waited and waited, and finally he saw Brian. Brian came home. I'm sure Nubs was so happy. Look at all the licks he's getting. Nubs leaped into his arms and covered him with kisses. Aw. Today, Nubs and Brian lead a busy life. They play at the dog beach and cruise around Brian's truck, and sometimes they go running or a hike in Mission Trails Regional Park. What a nice story. Nubs romps with his friends Bogey and Kublai. Nubs even goes to school. His trainer Graham gives him a straight A's. The small dog has done amazing things in his short life, and he chose to travel 70 miles alone across the desert to be with Brian. It was a miracle he survived. The bigger miracle may be that this dog of war chose to become a dog of peace. Now Nubs has a name and a person to call his own, and he shares his friendship and love he found with everyone he meets. Aww. But Nubs saves his best kisses for his best buddy, Brian. Well, that's a longer story than I thought it was, but isn't that a nice story? I know a lot of veterans have brought dogs home, and they really help them. This is a special story. Look at his little nubby ears. Aw, isn't that special? This dog got so attached to Brian. That was a really long story. I know a lot of people right now with being at home these 3 months really needed their pets, and a lot of dogs are being adopted. I know I really love my dog, and he gives me lots of hugs and kisses. It's so nice to have a pet. They love you unconditionally, and he sure did, didn't he? He really appreciated all the love Brian gave him. That was a really nice story and a really long story. All right, boys and girls, we have one more week. I have one more story for you, and then it's summertime, and I hope you keep reading on your own. I have more Bitmoji classrooms with lots and lots of books to keep you busy this summer. I'm going to put on Google Classroom. It'll be lots of fun for you. So look for those. I think I'm going to put them on Monday so that you have lots to do this summer. I will see you later. Bye-bye.